Hello and welcome to episode 9 of What If. I'm here with Anna Andersdottir and William Wofford. Thank you so much for joining me today. Anna is a moderator and administrator at a Star Trek Facebook page. And of course, as always, William Wofford, one of our co-producers, co-directors here at Trekkers Delight. Thank you so much for joining us. Please introduce yourself, Anna, for the people at home.
Well, my name is Anna Andersdottir. As you mentioned, I'm one of the administrators for the Star Trek shipposting Facebook group. We're just sort of a loose group of Trekkies who all enjoys getting together and talking about and debating about Star Trek and maybe being a little bit irreverent sometimes. We do try to we still try to uphold the ideals that Star Trek stands for. So unlike some other shitposting groups, you won't find some of the tolerance for bigotry that you might find elsewhere, the general intolerance you might find in what you would expect out of a shitposting group. But at the same time, we can be a little bit crude and we can be a little bit irreverent, and we do encourage that to some extent, within the boundaries allowed by the platform, of course.
I understand that. In fact, I very much encourage like Lower Decks and think of it as a great comic relief and see and understand the need for like that meme culture where you're being irreverent and so forth. So thank you so much for joining us. William, how are you? How are you doing
I'm
today?
good, man. Thanks for having me on the show today.
Of
It's been a good minute since we did a what if, and I'm very curious as to where we will go because of today's question. It was really, really interesting. It made me generate a lot of thoughts.
Yes, and we have some great ideas in the discussion. We just want to keep that juice going and to discuss it because Anna really sort of inspired a lot of great ideas through that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that came up was specifically, and I'm going to pull up the graphic here as we're sort of talking. I'm going to share my screen and flip it.
The timeline?
I can do that now. Yeah, the timeline.
This
and
one?
I've shared this with, yeah, that's it. Oh, you got it. That's good. And so if you look on this, it says timelines of Star Trek. Thank you. And you'll see here in yellow, you have the prime timeline. Okay. So moving through here, you have starting with Enterprise and then Discovery, Strange New Worlds, TOS, the original, the animated series, all the way up to TNG and everything that go and all the movies, you see them there in the middle there to DS9 and so forth until we get to LDS, Lower Decks, and then you have, I believe that's PRO is Picard, right? PRD?
Yes,
I
that's
didn't even
Picard.
know that was the thing for it. And then you see this red ball. It's a red and yellow ball, okay? And it says Romulan supernova.
Mm-hmm.
And you see a white arrow going all the way back, okay? And you see temporal incursion in 2233. And that's the Nero event, okay? Which splits off the blue line above it, you see, and that is the Kelvin timeline.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we know in the Kelvin timeline, you have Into Darkness, Beyond. And one of my favorite points, all the way, I'm so impressed that it was included, is the Time Soldier, Lieutenant Yor, making its way back to the prime timeline. And below that in the red, we have the mirror universe, of course. And so what was interesting about this and discussed with Anna is if you have this temporal incursion going back in time, the timeline of in the Kelvin world, in that Kelvin future, should no longer resemble, what we think of as being a lot of like what is in the prime timeline. And through these conversations, like what is a temporal incursion, how often they're actually happening, came up with Anna. So, Anna, if I were to ask you, how has the Kelvin timeline affected more than it seemed to?
So one of the things that we see here, and they do a very good job of illustrating it in the graphic, is that white dotted line with the arrows that goes from the Romulan supernova stretching back all the way to that temporal incursion in 2233, and that's where that blue line splits off. But if this is a map of the timeline and it's including incursions that cause these splits, that there should have been other incursions perhaps included. So both from the TOS era, specifically from the Voyage Home, from the TNG era, from the DS9 era, from the Voyager era. basically Star Trek can't help itself. They love time traveling, and they're constantly time traveling and doing incursions into the past. And so a lot of incursions that would have occurred in the prime timeline after 2233 were incursions to points predating Nero's incursion. And if Nero's incursion changes, if it splits off and creates this blue timeline and it changes what happens after 2233, then all of those incursions from the yellow timeline that go to points before 2233, if those incursions happen at all, they certainly happen differently. We know that the people of the prime timeline, their lives would have been affected by the Nero incursion. So events after Nero's arrival in the blue timeline won't look anything like events following 2233 in the prime timeline. And what I'm getting at is basically that the blue timeline should have just as many dotted and white lines going back to before Nero as the yellow timeline should have. And the yellow timeline should have more than is portrayed.
Okay. Now I'm going to throw it immediately to William. Thoughts, William? What do you got on this?
I think that I have a small theory, and I didn't really keep it to myself. I just didn't really feel the need to like speak on it, but I feel like now is the good time to speak on it. To Anna's point, she is correct. We should be seeing a lot more, but I will add to that. You know how like whenever we try to guess how the next episode of a new Star Trek show is going to go, and no matter what we guess, it's completely wrong. And but the script that we verbally write is always better than the one they give us. So, how I kind of view the timelines in this perspective is there's more. There's more than two, but for the sake of this episode, I'm going to narrow it down to two. So there's two different types of time travel. Now there are several methods of how you can get to the past, but there are two different types of time travel. There's the time travel where you directly affect the prime universe that you are in, and then there's the time travel where you branch off and create another timeline without affecting the prime universe that you are in. So we've seen both of those instances throughout multiple sci-fi shows, multiple sci-fi movies, especially Star Trek. This is what I think happened, and I don't think the writers thought this through. So I'm just going to put it out there and make a short film about it and hopefully make some money. So I think that, let me tell you what happened and what I think the writers did and what I think Star Trek was trying to do and what I think they should do. What I think the writers did was just say, to Anna's point, hey, we can't help ourselves. Let's just take this and make a time travel episode. We can't get the rights to this crew right now, so we're going to create a new timeline. Okay, that's what the writers were trying to do. This is what I think Star Trek was trying to do without saying it. Hey, we're just going to go back to the past. We're not going to care about what frequency or what phase variance we use to time travel because they don't really take those things into account. One of the things that Girardi said that really hit home for me was they had Spock. We ain't got no one. And Seven was like, we have the Borg Queen. So you have to take those things into account. When they had Spock and we have the Borg Queen, they pretty much have the calculations and the mental capacity to isolate that phase, that variance, that frequency needed to stay in the prime universe rather than create a whole new timeline. Because if the whole point is to go back to the past to fix what happened in your present, thus the future, then you have to make sure you stay in your own universe. Just like that, we have accidents all the time, which brings in the mirror universe. You bring in the transporter accidents. You bring in time travel episodes that ended up being accidents with the mirror universe. These were accidents. It's because they were accidents. They didn't necessarily stay in the prime or the mirror or the Kelvin universe. They were just all over the place. Now we know for the writer's sake point of view, they're just doing it just to make money so they can watch it. But as far as like the temporal mechanics of the whole situation, what I feel like that they, of course, you got the different paradoxes. That's great. But in those paradoxes, I guarantee that there is another paradox that suggests that a new timeline will be formed without affecting the your Earth One prime timeline. So,
and Star Trek has shown us, as you said, they've shown us multiple mechanisms of time travel. they have shown us time travel that results in the formation of a branching timeline. They've also shown us time travel that results in an alteration to what appears to be your own timeline, your own with the quantum signature of your own timeline. So, you know, I'm certainly open to the idea that,
because you see what I'm trying to say. It's just
right.
like, yeah, we're just trying to go into the past, but we don't care, but we don't know or don't care
Right.
where it lands us. And I don't think they really thought it through. Like
when we look at like the TNG episode Parallels, where we see that that's how they get all the Worfs back to where they're supposed to be, is they
where
figure,
they belong.
they match the Worf to the quantum signature of the Enterprise he came from. You know, I am open to the idea that Nero's incursion creates a new branch with its own quantum signature, and that therefore it can come from a timeline that it itself would never have spawned. But then we do run into, and this is why, just like O'Brien, just like Janeway, I hate temporal mechanics.
Right.
Like, this is why I agree with you also as to the off-screen reasons why they did this. I don't think that the writers or showrunners or that the people who were in charge of the movie universe necessarily thought through every detail of this puzzle that they built. I think they just wanted to make this movie, like you said,
just to make it.
And so, you know, I'm open to the idea that the Kelvin timeline can be a new branch that still came from an unaffected past that would match the prime timeline's past. But then we do end up with a timeline that is, we end up with a timeline that exists despite the fact that it will not generate the events that led to its own formation.
Right, because that's what branching off different timelines will do.
Right.
Like, it'll lead into a new, not a new, but a different ending.
Right.
Which,
and that would seem to be exactly the kind of timeline, a timeline that exists in spite of the fact that it will not generate the conditions that led to its own formation. Is exactly the kind of timeline that I would expect that the various time cops, that I would expect Captain Braxton and his crew, that I would expect Daniels to be trying to terminate.
Right. And so let me ask you this. By the time we know that the formation of all these different timelines and different universes, me personally, I don't even view the mirror universe as the universe. I just view that as a different timeline. I view each universe as a different timeline. That's kind of the perspective that I have. That said, we know that there was it was very short too, but it was all on one episode. They never brought it up again. And they kind of did it in Enterprise too, but this was in Deep Space Nine. I'm talking specifically. When they came across the planet that they couldn't escape, and they had to stay there, and their ancestors, their descendants were there, right? 200 years later, something like that. Okay, that's and right. they kind of did it again in Enterprise with the wormhole, and they had to loop around, and it was 15, 30, 40, 45 years in the past, however long it was. And so
that's right.
Right. And in both instances,
Enterprise Squared.
Thank you. And in both of those episodes, both of their descendants disappeared. And there is like this, their heart drops when they realize what they have. I'm not going to say what they've done, but what they had to do to preserve their own timeline by erasing or inadvertently erasing theirs. So maybe
in a way, their heart drops when they realize what they haven't done or what they will never do.
Right. So that being said, what if we're just going to call them time cops for the sake of this? What if the time cops said, dang, all of this is already here. Now, because all this is here, it formed us. But if we try to erase the focal point, the flash point, if you will, if you watch the flash point, then not only do we erase us, we erase countless billions of other lives that now exist because of this. So who are we to, in a sense, play God and not do this? I think this is what I think. I think the time cops' responsibility is to preserve their own prime universe, not the other different branches of time that have branched out. Notice I said that, remember, there's two different timelines, the two different types of time travel, not methods, two different types. The kind where it directly affects yours and the kind that it branches on others. They are not responsible for the ones that branches to others, the mirror universe, the Kelvin universe, the parallels. They're not responsible for that, or they don't call themselves responsible for that. They are responsible for the trials and tribulations, the Voyager paradoxes, Kirk episodes. They are responsible for anything that goes on directly in the prime, which is why they made it illegal eventually by the time Discovery went to the 32nd century.
That also, and you made me think about the Captain Braxton incident when Future Imperfect, when they go and they have that two-parter where, you know, the guy who's responsible for the computer revolution on Earth was able to accomplish all of that because he came across a crashed time ship. Basically, Captain Braxton and his entire agency, all of the Starfleet time cops that exist, are preserving a future that only exists because they lost one of their own ships in the past.
That's right.
They are preserving an entire timeline that exists because of a mistake they made. And so the idea that the time cops are preserving some sort of pure version of a timeline, some sort of version of a timeline as it would exist without incursion, is already thrown out the window there. Because they're not preserving any kind of pure timeline. They're not preserving a timeline as it would exist if time travel didn't affect it. They're preserving, specifically in that case, a timeline that only exists because one of their own time ships got lost in the past. And you were talking about, you know, who are we to play God? Who are we to wipe out a timeline that, you know, once it is established, has billions of lives dependent on it? Well, Jake Sisko wasn't worried about that in The Visitor. You know, what part of me, when I watched The Visitor, everyone else's heart breaks for Sisko, everyone else's heart breaks for Jake or for Ben, who you know, because it's a heart-wrenching episode about the relationship between them. And I see that, but my heart breaks for Melanie. Melanie is the girl who arrives at the beginning of the episode, who comes to meet old Jake Sisko, her favorite author, who by the end of the episode is leaving with one of his unpublished manuscripts clutched to her chest and says how much she's going to read it. And Jake, as Melanie is leaving, tells Melanie, hey, I want you to live every day to the fullest. I want you to take a minute to look around. Don't let life pass you by like I did, in pursuit of some, you know, in the dogged pursuit of some goal. And at the end of the episode, we're left with Melanie leaving with this manuscript clutched to her chest, talking about how it's gonna inspire her so much. But Jake has revealed his plan to her. And if Jake's plan is successful and he terminates this loop or this branch of the timeline by killing himself when he sees his father and sending his father back to the moment of the accident, he is talking about erasing an entire branch that he exists in, where he feels that he wasted his life, and that the event that he is talking about rewinding to and restoring this branch back to possibly predates Melanie's birth. He is talking about erasing the world that Melanie knows, and he has revealed that to Melanie, and I don't think she gets it because she is entirely too calm about it. And she leaves that episode with that manuscript clutched to her chest, as if her entire timeline isn't about to be erased.
And that's a very good point. So let me ask you this question, because we don't know the extent of how much the time cops are trying to fix or don't fix, and we know that certain events led to their existence and somewhat the progression of what we know as the Federation at that point. Is it possible that we know that they preserve their own existence? We get that. We even saw what Scotty did. We saw all of that. Is it possible that they pick and choose certain events to happen when they're supposed to happen versus the ones that are a result of the temporal Cold War, for instance? Like, that's not supposed to happen because they're going and destroying World War II. Like, that's clearly not supposed to happen. Right. So that said, it's like, because I remembered, and the reason why I give this question thought is because of what Guinan said to Picard. I'm surprised you didn't see that picture right there. Like, I thought it was going to be a spoiler, but you've always figured it out on your own. Basically, Rios was supposed to go back and have his family back in the 21st century.
Right.
Now he didn't destroy the timeline by doing that, but apparently that was always his destiny.
Right.
So, where do we go from here with that?
It feels to me like you're right. Like, I was talking before we started about how, with the sheer number of different factions that have access to time travel, as Enterprise showed us, with the sheer number of different factions that have access to time travel, as TNG showed us, and then as DS9 confirmed, and as Voyager confirmed, the idea that any agency could maintain the timeline perfectly and counteract every minor change that could occur through all of these countless incursions being carried out across time by so many different entities. The idea that they could maintain everything perfectly is kind of ridiculous.
Right.
They must be just interested in what they see as the general shape of the timeline, and they must therefore be interested in what you brought up. Kind of brings to mind the writers love to include these little magical things to get themselves out of trouble. And so when people ask how the transporter works, and they come up with this, they keep hitting this one wall. There's one wall that should prevent the transporter from working, and that's the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. So whenever you look at a diagram of a transporter system, there's an arrow pointing to a mystery box that exists inside the transporter called the Heisenberg
compensators.
They don't tell you how it works, but it's there, and it's there to counteract the problem that you saw.
Just like the Heisenberg bridge that we saw in Thor.
Right. And so when you're talking about time travel, and we're talking about how they're not maintaining the exact shape of the timeline, they're maintaining the overall shape of the timeline, and they're making sure that key events happen when they're supposed to. This sounds to me a lot like the way Doctor Who's writers got around, if he's a time traveler, why can't he just go fix that? Why can't he go change that? Because there's fixed points in time. There's things that have to happen, and they have to happen a certain way, and they have to happen at a certain time in order to maintain the general flow of the timeline. And that sort of creates a hierarchy where some moments and some interactions are key, and others are trivial and can be altered.
So that's probably how they pick and choose. Because one of the things, and it's not really going off topic, but I am migrating to a different show temporarily. The last season of The Legends of Tomorrow, before unfortunately it was canceled, they should have brought one more season to wrap it up.
I do like The Legends of Tomorrow a lot.
It's great. They actually kind of answered, even though it was in a fictional, fun way. They answered one of those questions, and they called it a focal point. When a certain event in history has to happen no matter what. It does not matter. There's no change to it. So I think you remember the episode, they tried so hard to get these three to not assassinate whoever the guy was before World War II, something like that. I don't know. It was something like that.
It was when they had to try over and over again to thwart the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
There you go.
Prior to World War One,
Prior to World War One, right. So they called it, if I recall correctly, they called it a focal point. Now, if we operate under that same principle as you stated throughout Trek timelines, well, not the game, throughout Trek history, then maybe that's the difference. It's like we may not really be we're concerned. They're definitely concerned, but we may not pay much care to how this happened as long as it happens. Which is what Legends of Tomorrow is all about. Like I always ask myself, how come they wait 2 weeks after the variant gets there before they try to fix it? Like, why don't you just meet him before it happens? And then you wouldn't have a good story. But
if you have the ability to lift yourself out of time and space as we know it to a different realm, and you have the option to build a dream team while you're there before you decide to come back to your own timeline to thwart some evil event, why would Captain Picard pick one other guy and come back to minutes before the disaster in Generations? you know, in generations, he is in the Nexus. He is outside of time and space as we know it. He can pick someone to come back with him, and he can pick to return at any point to thwart Soren. But what he does is he picks another old guy, so we can have a 3-way old man fight at the end of the film, and they come back to literally minutes before the missile launches. He could have come back with Kirk to 24 hours before.
Before the Enterprise was, well, not that I think Picard knew the Enterprise was destroyed, but before that, like,
right. But he chose to come back at the most dramatically. He came. It's like this choice had to have been made to serve the plot. It couldn't have been made logically.
Yeah, because if you're right, you're absolutely right. Because it's like I can see where he couldn't come back to a certain point where he would meet himself.
Mm-hmm.
I can kind of see that, because there have been multiple theories of if you meet yourself, all hell will break loose. But we've seen that in Timescape, or not Timescape, that Wormhole episode where he met himself and just the ship was just that's beside the point. I don't know what the hell they were doing with that. But with this, you're right. He, even if he couldn't be allowed to meet himself to warn him, he could have at least went to the earliest point he could. But that's what gets me. It's because even then, he was right there before the time ribbon came. So he should have been able to meet himself even then.
Right. If meeting himself was going to be a problem, then showing up minutes before the time ribbon hit would have resulted in him meeting himself.
I kind of just answered my own question, because it's just like, if he had the ability to basically pull a Logan and just get back into his past body without meeting himself, then he should have been able to go back before the Duras sisters destroyed the Enterprise.
He should have been able to go back to a point before they put Geordi through horrific torture.
Right. He should have been able to do that before the free. Well, and maybe,
granted, he didn't know about that yet.
The closest thing that I could possibly think would be a reason, and it's not even a good reason, but it's just the closest one I got, that he chose that point in time is because the time ribbon works in close proximity to wherever it's nearest to.
Possibly. I also feel like there's certain characters that, like, we all know about O'Brien must suffer. We know that.
Oh God!
They just repeatedly wrote suffering for O'Brien.
He deserved that statue.
But not only did they repeatedly write suffering for O'Brien, but there's other characters who they repeatedly kept harming in the same way. So, for example, every time they got bored, the writers would subject Deanna to some kind of mental violation. Every time they got bored, it also seems like okay, granted, if I were to count every time that Geordi got kidnapped and co-opted, it only happened twice, but it's weird that it happened twice. Like, Geordi tries to go on vacation, he gets kidnapped, tortured, and co-opted and brainwashed into being a Romulan agent. Geordi is minding his own business on a scientific mission, or on a mission on the space observatory, and he ends up getting kidnapped, tortured, and then co-opted. His implants are co-opted, so he gets turned into a spy, unbeknownst to him, for the Klingons. Like, they love having Geordi be kidnapped, tortured, and co-opted as an enemy agent.
Yeah.
I think, you know what, to add to that brings back, and we'll bring it back to the question of timelines here in a second, but that brings back why Troy was actually, is my favorite Trek character still to this day. Because she kind of, okay, so you know how, like, in Iron Man, go take it to Marvel for 2 seconds. You know how in Iron Man, in each Iron Man movie, that he learns his lesson from his previous encounters and improves upon his suit?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, Troy does the same thing. From the time that when I remember the disaster episode happened and she had to command the ship, what did she do? Well, about half a season later, maybe the next season, she takes the command test under Will Riker, right?
Right.
Okay.
She has a natural progression, yeah.
Okay, so that said, with the Violations episode when she was mentally raped, terrible episode. I felt so sorry that happened. But come Nemesis, she not only pushed Shinzon off, but she went against the Reman that tried to. She went into the Reman's mind and said, "Remember me."
Right. She did learn to use the non-consensual link between her and her assailant as a conduit, basically, to find him on a cloaked ship in space and to guide a torpedo up his ass.
Right. And then finally, she that I remember, she mentions to Data and Geordi that Romulans use a quantum singularity as a power source. And they're they're like, wait a minute, you remember that? So yeah. Anyway, please go ahead.
Well, she would have remembered during the episode Timescape when they encounter the Enterprise and the Romulan Warbird who are stuck in time during an apparent conflict, and they have to figure out what's happening.
Oh, great episode.
It's like
she figures out then, they go into detail then about how it's the quantum singularity at the core of the Romulan engine that made it a nest for those entities that were trying to use it as a nursery. Because it looked to them like the natural conditions in their chosen breeding ground, which is black holes.
Right. Yeah.
And when you fool around messing with quantum singularities and stars, what do you get? Time quakes and time.
Yes, apparently.
That's why I don't fool. Which kind of adds to why slingshotting around the star might actually work.
Right, and with the number, I think for me, what it all boils down to is and I keep repeating this one thing, but from the 60s through the present, by introducing so many reliable, repeatable methods of time travel, and by demonstrating to us that Jurati does say, we've got the Borg Queen, and they make that distinction that Spock was the special thing. Spock was the special element that allowed the Enterprise to time travel.
Exactly.
But all these other people who are obviously time traveling don't have Spock.
They weren't thinking.
The Captain's Holiday episode, where we see these time travelers come back and try and take the Takshutat from Picard and from Vash. They don't have Spock. All those people Daniels was fighting, they don't have Spock. Whoever built the Guardian of Forever doesn't have Spock.
Oh, man.
It's one of these things where they made a big deal about how Spock was essential to time travel and the Borg Queen is an adequate substitute. But in Star Trek IV, when they take that Klingon fleet trap back in time and they're having trouble figuring out how to get back to the future, Spock is talking about how it's going to be hard for him to calculate how to come back to the future with just the power of his own mind. He doubts his ability. Right. And he says he really wishes he had access to a more advanced computer like he did on the Enterprise.
I didn't know he mentioned that.
So yeah, there's a whole scene in Star Trek IV where Spock expresses doubt in his own ability to make the necessary calculations to get that warbird or to get that Klingon bird of prey
back home
to the future. And they tell him, you know what, we trust you. Kirk trusts your best guess. I trust your best guess.
Oh, it was the scene between Spock and Bones. He's like, yeah,
that's right. And so Spock doubts his own ability to do it with just the power of his own mind. He wishes he had a better computer at his disposal. And so because we see so many other factions and so many other entities engaging in time travel without Spock's help, and because even Spock doubts his own brain's ability to make the calculations without the help of a more advanced computer, I don't know that I bought that line in Picard where they said, oh, Spock was the essential ingredient to the Enterprise's time travel.
I mean,
to me, it seems like...
I don't think they knew that he was taking a guess. I mean, you don't really put that in your blog for history, right? Do you think?
And so, while Spock is amazing, and I love Spock, and I think Spock's mental acuity is probably off the charts, somehow they keep portraying Spock. They keep portraying his hybridization as a strength. They keep saying that somehow Spock, as a result of being a combination of human and Vulcan, is greater than the sum of his parts. And I don't reject that at all. Possibly he is, but it seems like they make a much bigger deal about that in new Star Trek than they did in older Star Trek. In older Star Trek, he spends a lot of time coming to terms with it, and he spends a lot of time finding the beauty in his hybridization, despite what his Vulcan peers think of him.
Yeah.
But in new Star Trek, they're spending a lot of time not only having him accept it and learn to find the beauty in it, they're spending a lot of time making it sound like it makes him even more exceptional than you might expect. But But Spock being the essential ingredient, his intellect being the essential ingredient to time travel, just doesn't seem to hold up with everything else Star Trek has shown us about how accessible time travel actually is in their universe.
Yes.
I think so. I'm sorry, Manny. You've been going. I'm sure you have plenty of thoughts.
I do. I mean, I'm listening intently because this is all really good stuff. I'm going to let you say your piece, and then I want to bring us back to the Kelvin timeline specifically. Go ahead, man.
I kind of want to know, not that there's anyone that wrote it yet. I kind of want to know what the temporal prime directive is. I want to know. The reason being is because Anna made a very good point that there are other different aliens and species that have the method of time travel. Okay, that said, you have the edge of tomorrow, that little stone. That's one. You have the wormhole, which we've learned is also a time travel conduit. We've learned many different species have the ability to time travel. So it kind of makes me wonder, A, was the temporal police a part of the temporal accords? And if they were, what aside from the Federation isolated time travel incidents, what about other species that have the ability to time travel?
How do they define their scope of responsibility?
Thank you. Because I've already suggested that maybe the other universes is not within their range. Mm-hmm. But now I'm thinking it's probably more narrow than that. Otherwise, a lot of this stuff would have been. And we know that it's the writers just doing what they do. But as far as Trek lore goes, maybe their scope of responsibility is narrower than we think, or maybe they're just ignorant. So, yeah.
Did Captain Braxton and his agency, did they decide they didn't need to intervene when Professor Rasmussen came back in TNG because they knew that
he'll be sent back, or not sent back, but his ship will be sent back, and he wouldn't be able to take the technology back to where he came from.
So as long as they know that a time travel incident will be self-contained by the people who encounter it in their timeline, do they just decide they don't have to go respond to that incident? Because otherwise, where were they during Captain's Holiday? And where were they during yesterday's Enterprise? Where were they during I can't remember the name of the episode, but the one where Professor Rasmussen comes aboard and turns out to be a con man who's got a stolen time ship.
Yeah. Okay.
So in each of those incidents, those appear to be self-contained incursions where someone did do a time incursion, but it managed to become self-contained. Its effects managed to be mitigated without their help. So maybe they decided they didn't have to prevent those incursions. Or in other cases, maybe they thought they didn't prevent those incursions because, as was the case with Future Imperfect in Voyager, maybe that incursion was actually necessary, and without it, they wouldn't exist.
Just like the whole season of Year of Hell. I'm sorry, the 2 episodes of Year of Hell was technically self-contained because of what Janeway did.
Right.
Yes. And
if someone like Anarax exists, who can build a ship that can do what his ship can do.
Oh, wow.
You would think that would be exactly what Captain Braxton and his buddies, or Daniels and his buddies, would be responding to. But maybe they didn't have to, because they knew Janeway would show up and erase that whole thing from history by blowing up its own time core and having the ship erase itself.
Yes.
All right, go ahead, Manny. Yeah.
Okay. It just brings me to you're talking about incursions and whether they're self-contained or not. I'm going to bring us right back to this timeline thing here, and you'll see where we have the Romulan supernova, and they come back here, and we start the Kelvin timeline here. If we follow the blue line all the way past, beyond, whatever, we get here to Time Soldier Yor.
What happened there?
Okay, so along this timeline, which is I don't know how this follows the prime timeline, but it follows it well enough so that this is Lieutenant Yor. Why are we? And I forget the name of his species.
He looks like a Raymond is what he looks like.
And I'm so sorry if you remember it's the first time we see the species. We see them in cartoon form, whatever.
So it's a space orc.
Yes. And so this uniform, okay, is what's super interesting about this, because if you look at the time frame here, this is 2379, which
Apparently,
is
he's
the
a
time.
Betelgeusian.
Betelgeuse, yes, that's right. I knew it was that star, that close star, whatever. Yes. If this is 2379, this is the same time as Nemesis.
Which means his
Technically.
uniform should be dark gray and black.
Right. So we see him 2379 wearing a uniform that looks like a prime timeline 2360s uniform.
Early TNG, first 2 seasons.
Right. So he's wearing a uniform that in the prime timeline would be about 15 years out of date.
Oh, now this is a very interesting question then. What's going on then?
Well,
Anna.
For me, we're looking at something where obviously if you change anything about the state of the universe, eventually, you know, I don't know how you feel about determinism. I don't want to get into determinism because it makes it hard for me to sleep at night. But when we're talking about the difference between details versus the overall shape of the timeline, I don't know what level of granularity the time cops have and what level of granularity they can exercise control over. But one thing that we were talking about being the general shape of the timeline versus the specific details of a timeline makes me think that obviously in the Kelvin timeline, you know, we have someone who comes from 2379 wearing a uniform that looks like it belongs in the prime timeline from 15 years prior. Now, he is described as some kind of, you know, he's a time soldier. He figures out a way to, you know, somehow he ends up hopping from the Kelvin timeline to the prime timeline.
Right.
He is described as a time soldier. Maybe the reason he's dressed that way is because he was attempting an incursion in the 2360s.
But it didn't work and he landed in the wrong place.
Maybe he landed in the wrong era. Or maybe the reason he's dressed that way is because that is how people from his timeline dress in 2379. And if that's the case, then we may be looking at a situation where certain things about the general shape of the timeline, like certain things that would lead us to particular design decisions, still happen, but they happen in a different order, or they happen on a different schedule. And so the question is he dressed in his native clothing, or is he dressed in clothing that was meant to be his size?
I think I'm following you now. So he came from the Kelvin timeline, which we know goes on. It goes on and it doesn't stop. Even if they make any more J.J. Abrams films, we know that Kelvin timeline is going to go on. That said, it happened. The Kelvin TNG era still happens, but it happens at a later point. Or maybe it's just a different design. Maybe it's just a different design. Because when I looked at his uniform, it's possible. So when I looked at his uniform, I noticed that he had an extra yellow line, whereas they didn't have that in our prime line. Timeline.
Well, they did at the beginning of TNG.
They did. Okay.
At the very beginning of TNG, they're wearing a uniform that has a line of piping across their shoulders that's the same color as their division color on the bottom of the uniform. Right. And you know, you see when Picard tugs his shirt down in later seasons, he's doing that because they switched them to a two-piece. But in the first season, he never does that shirt tug maneuver because he's wearing effectively a spandex leotard.
Yeah.
Like this.
Those.
Right. Can we pull up the picture of your again?
Sure.
Yeah, see those two lines right there?
Yeah.
At the top?
So he has an extra line of piping that's not present in Geordi's uniform.
That's what I was referring to. Yeah, because it's the same, but slightly, or maybe it's just wider because of his neck. Well,
right around his collar, you do see that Geordi has that line around his collar, so he does have two of them.
But the ensign doesn't. But the ensign does not. Oh,
right, and that was another issue, was that they had hero uniforms and extra uniforms, and when you look at a hero uniform versus an extra uniform, the zipper placement is different.
Okay. Oh, wow.
So Yor has the front zipper, but he's also got the extra piping. So this is not exactly like either of those uniforms. Well, it is a lot like Jordy's, which has the front zipper and the extra piping. But it's not like Gomez's uniform here, which has the front zipper and no extra piping. And so when we look at the problem with looking at uniform designs from early TNG is that for budgetary reasons, we had hero uniforms, extra uniforms, and that in later seasons, once everyone switched to the wool two-piece, extras in the background were still wearing the extra piping onesie sometimes.
Yeah, we've learned that different uniforms are like different choices throughout the quadrant. Like
right. And so, on the bridge of the Enterprise in seasons, 3 through 7 of TNG, we frequently see background characters who are still wearing the season 1 uniform with the piping on it on the shoulder.
Yeah.
Just because that's what they happen to have in wardrobe.
Okay. So my assumption was
yes.
Sorry, and I didn't mention.
No. Please, Manny, please. That's what I was going to say. Please, yeah.
Okay. Is that that it's a creative choice from the writers, because they could have done anything, right? If you look at the actual timeline incursion of this actual thing, he's going to a time before Disco but after Picard, and and the doctor analyst guy says quite specifically that he's a time soldier, and that time travel no longer happens at the time. Like something happened with the time accords and stuff like that. So time travel, they don't do time travel anymore. Those time cops don't exist anymore in the same form that they did.
But who's enforcing that?
Yeah, who's enforcing that?
I have no idea about any. That's why it was so interesting to me as an idea.
So one interesting thing that we can see here is, and we've observed this in Lower Decks, we've also observed this in Generations. So when they had that uniform change between TNG and DS9, when it switched from black shoulders, division color shirt to black shirt with division color shoulders.
Yeah.
And that's how the Voyager uniforms are
the Voyager uniforms, and we saw a cross of that in Generations.
In Generations, you saw both uniforms on people on the same ship at the same time. And in TNG, throughout the run of the series, we also saw both the old piping uniform and the new two-piece uniform on people at the same time. Starfleet does not seem to be... So first of all, Starfleet seems to be constantly revising their fashion choices. And they do not seem to be very rigid about enforcing those fashion choices across the fleet or even across the same ship. You can see people serving in Starfleet simultaneously, even on the same ship concurrently, wearing different versions of the Starfleet uniform. And when we get all the way up to... So if Time Soldier Yor comes from 2379, that's only 1 year before Lower Decks. Lower Decks starts in 2380. And by Lower Decks, we see that they've adopted a uniform after, they've stopped using the purple shoulder, black shirt, division color undershirt uniform that we saw from the TNG movies and that we saw from wartime DS9 and that we saw from late Voyager. They've gone back to using a uniform that looks a lot more like a TNG uniform, but it's not quite one. It's got a flap, kind of like the Monster Maroon uniforms from the TOS films.
They kind of went backwards a little bit.
Right.
I noticed that.
But not only are they wearing a uniform where the color and design choices are like TNG combined with the TOS films, they also show that in some corners of Starfleet, like aboard the Titan, they are still wearing the DS9 wartime uniforms. And even by the time of Lower Decks, we are seeing that there is quite a lot of variety in Starfleet uniform design being worn by officers who are serving concurrently in different places. And so it is entirely possible to me that in the Kelvin timeline version of 2379 or 2380, that might be the case for them too. And maybe Yor is wearing a uniform that is one of the choices, one of the approved regulation choices for Starfleet where he's from. Or maybe it's not that he's wearing his native clothing. Maybe the clothing he's wearing was meant to be a disguise, and he was aiming for 2360s and ended up arriving, at the wrong time in the future. He ended up arriving at the wrong time in the prime timeline, rather.
I'm actually looking for a picture because for years I was pretty hell bent on they don't change uniforms unless it's a different timeline. They don't change uniforms unless it's a different timeline. And you're right, they kind of go all over the place. Anyway, I can't find the picture, but I'm just going to talk about it. So
That's okay.
All right. So at first, I thought each show was set the way they were supposed to be set. I thought there was a specific reason. I thought the black tops with the red colors were like early TNG Alpha Quadrant Federation uniforms, and I thought that the red top with the black bottoms were deep space missions, like type thing. Voyager, Deep Space Nine. I thought it was like, okay, those deep ones, you can kind of tell which one's in the Alpha Quadrant and which ones are on the edge, maybe in different quadrants. Okay. I was wrong because the peace treaty scene in Deep Space Nine, and I did not notice this until I watched it again. There is actually everyone. The 90% of the room that is in the Federation is wearing the Sovereign class, Titan class, black and gray uniforms. Okay. There is one man, and he's clearly an extra, but there is one man standing on the side by the window. He's just standing there. He's not even a security guard. He has a red uniform on, but that's the problem. It's not a problem, but that's the thing. It's a red uniform. He had a black top with red bottom. That's it. That's it. He's actually on the left side when they pan later on in the scene. He has a red bottom. So it's not the Voyager uniform. It's not the Deep Space Nine, early Deep Space Nine uniforms. It's a mid-season, it's the mid-show TNG uniform that he's just wearing.
And in the episode Explorers of Deep Space Nine, where Jake and Ben build the Bajoran sail ship and they prove that you could sail to Cardassia with it, the B plot of that episode involves Bashir, who was the salutatorian of his class, meeting and feeling like he got snubbed by the valedictorian. And
that's right.
The valedictorian of his class serves on a starship, and she has been serving on a starship whose mission was specifically to explore the edge, to map the edges of known space, and to go to places that have not previously been visited. So she is on a deep space mission aboard a starship out in the middle of nowhere, mapping new territory. But when she arrives on Deep Space Nine, she is not wearing a Deep Space Nine or Voyager style uniform. She is wearing the TNG style uniform, despite being on a deep space mission.
Right. So it feels like, again, we know what so we know what the writers are doing, but if we were to place fashion blame on the Federation, they're just doing this all over the place. It seems like that there is like a minimum requirement and be like, hey, we prefer you wear this, but you can wear this. Go ahead.
Having I have not served in the military myself, but having grown up in a military family, having been born on a military base and gone to school on a military base, I remember there being, I was around when they did uniform changes. When they switched from one type of BDU to another type of uniform, when everyone went from the more organic looking camo to the digital camo. I've been around during periods when military uniforms changed, and there is a very, very narrow period of overlap when I was a kid walking around the base, when I would see people wearing both uniforms, but they're called uniforms for a reason. And generally speaking, they expect everyone to conform to whatever the new uniform is within a short period of time, because there's a reason they're called uniforms and there's a reason they switched. And so usually the new uniform is considered the new standard for some reason, and everyone is expected to switch to it at some point within a timely manner. But in Starfleet, it seems like there's a lot more latitude and a lot more variety among the regulation acceptable uniforms that one can wear at any given time.
I agree. And I actually do remember going from olive drab to digital pattern. I had both when I was serving.
And how long did they let people keep wearing the old ones when they switched to digital camo for you?
So what happened, actually, because I got to live through that, was I had olive drab, and all of my stuff was like given to me like that. And it went unit by unit. And so it was like, okay, it's going to come and whatever. And when it came for the entire unit. We all lined up for CQ. But that is a time, and it's not Star Trek time, when the physical uniforms had to arrive in boxes addressed to us. I had to go to my regimental quartermaster and be like, I'm now signing that I've received 3 sets of this and that it has to be maintained or whatever. And I had to hand in my olive drab. Those things are super protected because some people, I guess, take them and then sell them on eBay and stuff. Same thing with the boots and all that stuff.
Okay.
So I was only able to get it once I handed in my old uniform. And that turnover, I would see it happen. I would visit other bases and I'd be like, oh, you guys got the digit. And we were all super envious that they got the like newest stuff. And we were still in the olive drab and the stuff that goes with it. So
when it was time for your unit to switch, if you had said, no, I want to keep my olive drab, would they have let you?
No.
Right.
It was an off. No way.
And so on a starship, when they say, hey, now the Enterprise is going to be switching to these new uniforms, these new Voyager-style uniforms, how is it that there are some ensigns in the background that said, no, I don't think I will?
I do have a theory. I think this will satisfy both William and Anna in this case. Okay. There are many times that I've noticed in the Star Trek world when soldiers, officers, have different uniforms for different reasons. O'Brien was famous for first adding pockets and roll-up sleeves and stuff. I'm not an officer. I should have sleeves. Like he altered the uniform in such a way because like it didn't make sense for him. And him as an actor said, I need to be able to have this stuff. And that made sense. It made more sense to have those things. There are times when Picard goes off and he wears like the all black stuff. Red Squad had their own thing. They made all these alterations to the thing. When someone is captaining a ship, they have the right, and as a captain, I'll tell you this, to set the dress and deportment for all of their staff. They get to actually have in the standard operating procedures, the SOPs, what they are. So if you tell them you have to wear these things, you have to. But if they're left ambiguous, it's the first officer actually enforces dress and deportment. They go around and they make sure that, whatever, and they empower the sergeants to make sure to have certain boots or whatever that's allowed. Now, you can have a variation within that. Let's say the cadets are running drills or whatever. They're wearing this today. That's what's going to come out of the replicator. When you ask for that, what's happening today? It's not even like a choice. It's kind of like that's what's standard. But if within a cycle of things that you can choose, I'm going to wear this today or this pattern or whatever, it's probably pre-approved in an SOP. That's actually like...
So maybe Starfleet leaves that a little bit vague, and it is up to the commander of whatever the post is, whether it be a starship or a station, to write the specific rules for the people under his command. Correct. And in that case, then we're definitely looking at, in Picard's case, Picard is very permissive in that respect. Picard does not care what people are wearing so long as it is a Starfleet uniform. I think that maybe if this were Jellicoe's Enterprise.
I was about to say
we all thought about Jellicoe.
I was literally thinking about that because I already didn't like him, but I hated his guts when he said what he said to Deanna. I said, I will slap the shit out of you. Don't go for that. Not that one. Not that one.
Yeah, if this was Jellicoe's Enterprise, maybe we would only see one kind of uniform across the board.
One kind of uniform, yes.
Right.
So that
actually makes military sense. Yeah,
that does make sense.
I'm going to pin it there, guys. It's been a whole wonderful hour.
Wow.
Thank you so much. Yeah, did you guys have a good time?
I had a good time.
Yeah.
I would do this again on purpose.
That's great. I love that. Thanks so much for joining us. And I'm really happy that we get to talk a little bit. First of all, of course, I want to know more about Lieutenant Yor, and I want to know more about the Time Soldiers. I have so many more questions still, like that's coming up that's bothering me. For instance, in Picard, a lot of loose threads, like the sentient bacteria or whatever, still bothers me. What is that AI that came out? What are we doing with the new Borg? Yes! Oh my God! Oh, I'm gonna run and get mine.
I knew that would get him. This is the prequel, so to speak, before the Star Trek 2009. So this takes place before Nemesis and before the 2009 reboot.
Oh, these are the comics.
Yes. So that's Picard.
Yes.
Right. This talks about all of the events leading up to the supernova.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
I've
what?
looked over the Countdown comics a little bit. I don't own a copy myself yet, but I've been reading about them and doing a lot of research for my own purposes. I've been looking at the Countdown comic content.
Huh.
So we see it. Of course, this is a comic series, but the uniforms are already different, but they're kind of similar.
Right.
So they kind of went with the same premise in the Picard and Prodigy series, that they kind of backtracked and went back a little bit to the TNG red top or red bottom type uniforms.
see it.
Which I think the uniforms is probably, there you go. The uniforms is a topic all by itself.
Yeah.
Like,
I was hoping that it would pertain to time travel, to be honest. So anyway, until next time, thanks so much for joining us, guys. And I hope to see you again soon. Maybe we can do something else in the meantime. And thanks for joining us, Anna. Any last words? Anything you want to say before we go to the sequence?
Just, I had a great time, and thank you for inviting me. I would love to talk more about any of this. Really, if it pertains to Star Trek, I'm happy to talk about it.
Will, thanks again for joining us. Any last words, man?
I had a great time. Every time I do a what if, there's always exploration. You know, every show and every sci-fi series has their own what ifs. But whenever I'm in a what if with my friend Manny and Marie and Jermaine and now Anna and anyone else from Trackers Delight, it makes me think things that I never considered. How did Q put it? I was open to options that I had never considered. And that is the exploration that awaits me.
At some point, I do want to talk with some other Trek nerds about Guinan and Picard's relationship.
I really want to.
I think it hits a lot of, and
oh my goodness,
not exactly, but it hits a lot of the same River Song, Doctor Who. Every time they meet each other, they're meeting each other in the wrong order, kind of model. You know, that
I love that.
It feels like Guinan keeps meeting, or Picard keeps meeting Guinan.
Time zero.
Out of order, basically. Their lives are inexorably intertwined, and they keep encountering each other at earlier and earlier points in Guinan's life.
Yeah. Which it makes you ask the question, what was their, maybe not their initial meeting, but what was their relationship like? How welcoming was Guinan when Picard, in his perspective, first met Guinan?
Right. Picard's first meeting with Guinan and Guinan's first meeting with Picard are two different events.
Right. She already knew him.
Different ends of their relationship. And the fact that they are linked together forever in the Nexus, because a part of each of them remains in the Nexus forever.
Oh,
and they are both connected to each other in the Nexus outside of space and time.
Oh my God, you're right. They're always going to be there.
I was just watching that episode actually when we were talking about.
I didn't remember.
There's a whole episode on What If called The Nexus in the Burn.
We did do that.
We did that episode.
We did that episode.
I'll leave it. I got to leave it there, guys.
Okay.
No. I thank you so much for bringing it up. Until next time, join us again for What If. Thanks so much for joining us. Take care.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm not going to ever say it on the internet. Yeah, never.
I'm sorry. Wait. There was a shadow of a church.
Okay. What?
William has questionable ideas about what he puts. William has questionable ideas about what he puts on the internet.
Oh, I remember that episode. I remember that episode. Yeah.
Wait. What?
We put on an audio version of this podcast.